The bull went completely wild at the auction, terrifying everyone, until a poor teen simply lifted a finger and it instantly stopped. What happens next will leave you speechless. The lead rope snapped with a sound like a whip crack. One moment the massive black bull was straining against his handler's grip, muscles rippling like waves under taut hide. The next, the thick cord burst free, the frayed end whipping into the dust. Ironjaw lunged forward, head low, nostrils flaring as a cloud of dirt exploded beneath his hooves. The handler, a burly man in a faded blue work shirt, went flying backward, landing hard against the wooden rail with a grunt that was lost in the uproar of shouts around him. Another man tried to grab the bull's flank to slow him, but Ironjaw twisted violently, his horn catching the man's shoulder and sending him spinning to the ground. Elias Kane's breath caught in his chest. He'd been standing a few yards from the auction ring, holding a clipboard for old Mr. Tanner, his employer. Just minutes earlier, he'd been half distracted, watching the auctioneer rattle through numbers for a pen of sheep, but now all his focus was on the black mountain of muscle rampaging toward the open yard. The air was suddenly alive with noise, boots pounding on dirt, wood cracking as people scrambled up onto rails. The auctioneer's amplified voice cut off mid-sentence. The thick, hot smell of livestock mixed with the acrid tang of dust kicked up by the bull's hooves. Elias's ears caught frantic orders from handlers. "Shut the gate! Get the rope!" But Ironjaw was already beyond their reach. The bull's eyes burned with a strange intensity, not the wild, rolling look of a panicked animal, but something more focused. Elias felt an odd chill crawl along the back of his neck. He'd seen bulls panic before. This wasn't panic. This was purpose. Through the chaos, a figure caught Elias's attention, a man leaning casually against the far fence line, wearing a dusty brown coat despite the heat. He wasn't running like the others. Instead, he tapped a small piece of metal against the wooden rail, a slow, deliberate rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. Ironjaw's gaze flicked toward that sound for the briefest second before returning to the open path ahead. Elias's mind tried to make sense of it, but there was no time. The bull was angling toward the main gate, which had been left half open for the next lot of animals. Beyond that gate, pressed against a corner of the fence, were 3 small children, 2 boys and a toddler clinging to the older one's leg. They were frozen, their wide eyes fixed on the massive creature bearing down on them. Elias's chest tightened. The handlers were too far. The gate crew hadn't noticed the danger yet. Every instinct in him screamed to move, but his legs felt heavy, like the dry dirt had turned to wet clay around his boots. Ironjaw's hooves thundered closer. The crowd's panic seemed to narrow into a tunnel of sound, muffled except for the deep, steady thud of each step. Elias's vision tunneled too. He saw the dust swirling up behind the bull, the taut muscles of its neck, the foam beginning to gather at the corners of its mouth. The children didn't scream. They didn't even flinch. They just clung to each other as if they already knew what was coming. "Move!" someone yelled behind Elias, the voice sharp with fear. That shout broke the weight in his legs. Elias lurched forward, dodging past 2 men who were struggling to uncoil a rope. He didn't think about what he would do if the bull reached him. He only knew that he had to reach the gate first. His boots pounded against the dry ground, dust coating his throat. The heat pressed against his back like a heavy hand, the sun turning the air above the yard into a shimmering haze. Ironjaw's head swung toward him mid-stride, dark eyes locking on him for the first time. There was no hesitation in that look, only assessment, as if the bull was deciding whether Elias was an obstacle worth removing. The brown-coated man's tapping stopped. Elias noticed the sudden stillness from the corner of his eye, and something about it made his stomach tighten. Whatever control or connection that tapping had over Ironjaw, it was gone now. That meant the bull's next move would be entirely his own. The space between them shrank in heartbeats. Elias saw the children's faces more clearly now. One boy's mouth was open in a soundless cry, the toddler's cheeks streaked with dust and tears. The fence they were pressed against was sturdy enough for cattle, but a bull of Ironjaw's size could splinter it like kindling if he chose. "Get back!" Elias shouted, his voice breaking from the strain, though he doubted they could hear him over the pounding hooves. He planted himself between Ironjaw and the gate without fully realizing he'd done it, his chest heaving, arms slightly out to the sides. The bull slowed for just a fraction of a second, nostrils flaring, the air between them heavy with heat and the smell of sweat and earth. Elias's pulse roared in his ears. He couldn't run now. If he turned his back, it would be over. Ironjaw's massive shoulders bunched as he took another step forward, close enough that Elias could see the faint scar running along the bridge of his nose, an old wound that spoke of other battles. The bull's breathing was deep, measured. It was as if he was waiting for something, for Elias to flinch, for an opening to charge. Elias's gaze darted again toward the man in the brown coat. He was still there, standing utterly still now, watching. Elias didn't know why, but he had the unshakable feeling that the man had been part of this from the start. That this wasn't just an accident, and that Ironjaw's path toward the children hadn't been entirely his choice. The handlers were still too far away. The rope wasn't ready. The gate crew had finally noticed the danger, but the narrow space between the bull and the children meant they couldn't close it without trapping them inside. It was down to him. Somewhere deep inside, past the fear and the racing thoughts, a strange calm began to take root. Elias didn't have a plan, didn't have a weapon, only a sudden fierce certainty that he could not move from this spot. He lifted his right hand slowly, palm outward, fingers spread. The movement caught Ironjaw's eye. For a heartbeat, the bull froze, ears twitching slightly, his massive head tilting just enough to keep both Elias and the children in view. The dust swirled lazily between them, the air thick with the mingled scent of hay, sweat, and something else, an unspoken tension, like the final moment before a storm breaks. Around them, the chaos of the yard seemed to fade. The crowd had gone quiet, voices dropping into a hush of disbelief. The handlers stopped where they were, afraid to spook the bull further. The children still hadn't moved, their eyes fixed on the strange standoff. Elias felt the weight of every gaze on him, but he didn't lower his hand. He kept it steady, breathing slowly, his eyes locked with Ironjaw's as if there were an understanding between them that no one else could see. And then, as if testing the moment, the bull's ears flicked back, his front hoof stamping once in the dirt. The sound was deep, final, like a warning. Elias didn't blink. Ironjaw's breathing slowed, his stance easing ever so slightly. The raw tension in the yard began to shift, not gone, but altered, as though the danger had paused rather than ended. And that's when Elias realized the bull was headed toward the auction's main gate, where several small children stood trapped against the fence. Panic surged through the ring like wildfire. The air filled with shouts and the pounding of boots as men scrambled for safety, climbing the wooden rails or darting for open spaces. The heavy scent of dust and fear hung thick in the summer heat, every movement stirring more of it into the air. A man near the gate yelled, "Close it! Close it now!" But his voice was swallowed in the chaos. Ironjaw's massive frame barreled forward, his raw power turning every attempted interception into a futile gesture. One handler tried to swing a loop of rope toward the bull's horns, but the animal tossed his head violently, sending the rope flying from the man's grasp. Elias's heart was hammering so hard it felt like it might burst from his chest. His eyes locked on the children pinned against the splintering wooden fence, the two older boys shielding the youngest between them. Their small hands gripped the boards until their knuckles turned white, but their legs seemed frozen, unable to obey any instinct to flee. Elias could hear the wood groaning under the pressure of their weight and the vibration of Ironjaw's charging steps. He had no rope, no stick, no weapon, just his body and a certainty that if he didn't act now, the sound of that fence breaking would be the last thing those children ever heard. The crowd around him had already moved back, unwilling to put themselves in the path of the bull's horns. Every fiber of Elias's being screamed that this was reckless, but the thought of doing nothing was worse. Without giving himself time to think, Elias vaulted over the low fence beside him. His boots hit the packed dirt hard, sliding a half step before he regained his balance. The heat rising from the ground seemed to wrap around his legs like something physical, slowing his sprint as he closed the distance between himself and the bull. Gasps and shouts followed him. Someone screamed, "Kid, get out of there!" But Elias ignored them. Ironjaw's bulk loomed larger with every stride, the glint of sunlight on the bull's curved horns making them look like sharpened steel. Then Elias's eyes flicked to the side, catching sight of the man in the brown coat again. He was still near the fence line, but now his hands were still, the metallic tapping gone. His stance was rigid, and his gaze was fixed intently on the bull, as if waiting to see what would happen without the sound. Elias's gut tightened. This wasn't just a rampaging animal, it was as if Ironjaw's fury had been aimed, not random. Elias planted himself between the bull and the gate, legs braced, chest heaving. The crowd's voices blended into a low hum in the back of his mind, but he could hear Ironjaw's labored breathing clearly, like the rumble of distant thunder. The bull slowed just slightly, enough to size up the boy standing in his way. His head swayed from side to side, hooves grinding into the dirt with each step. Elias's hands trembled, not from weakness, but from the strain of standing his ground when every instinct screamed to move. Then, acting on something he couldn't explain, Elias slowly raised his right hand, palm outward, fingers spread. The motion was steady, deliberate. Ironjaw's eyes locked on him. The two stood like statues, the air between them heavy with tension. Dust swirled around the bull's hooves, carried in lazy spirals by the faint breeze, but neither moved. Elias's breathing slowed. He tried to keep his thoughts empty, focusing only on holding his hand steady and meeting the bull's gaze. Seconds stretched. The muscles along Ironjaw's shoulders and flanks rippled, tensing as though ready to launch forward. Elias felt the weight of that moment like a boulder pressing on his chest. If the bull decided to charge, there would be no time to dodge, no chance to survive unscathed. Somewhere behind the bull, the man in the brown coat shifted, just slightly. It wasn't much, but Elias caught it, and his suspicion deepened. The movement broke the perfect stillness of the scene. Ironjaw's ears flicked back, and his head dipped, not in preparation to strike, but in a deep, heavy breath that sent a cloud of warm air into the space between them. The crowd seemed unsure whether to breathe. Men who had been halfway up the rails stopped moving. A handler's knuckles whitened on the rope in his hand, afraid to try anything that might undo whatever was happening. Elias stepped slowly to his left, eyes still on Ironjaw, guiding the bull's gaze just enough to angle him away from the children. The movement was cautious, measured, every step deliberate. Ironjaw's massive head followed, and the tension in his frame seemed to ease fractionally. Then, in a motion so sudden it startled even Elias, Ironjaw turned his entire body toward the far side of the yard. His trot was slow at first, then steady, each step kicking up small bursts of dust. By the time he reached the far pen, he was no longer thrashing or tossing his head, just snorting softly, as if the earlier frenzy had been wiped away. For a heartbeat, the yard remained silent. Then the cheers erupted, shouts of disbelief, applause, voices calling Elias's name, though many didn't even know it. Men clapped each other on the back, shaking their heads as if they couldn't believe what they'd just seen. Elias didn't return their excitement. His eyes were fixed on the man in the brown coat. The man wasn't clapping or smiling. He was slipping something small and metallic into his pocket before turning away and disappearing into the crowd. Elias's suspicion solidified into certainty, because he'd seen him slip a small device into his pocket before disappearing into the crowd. The rest of the auction moved on, but the charged air refused to settle. Every few minutes, someone would glance Elias's way, murmur something to a neighbor, and nod in his direction. A few men even clapped him on the back as they passed, their voices low but tinged with awe. "Quick thinking, boy," one said. "Never seen a bull stop like that." Another muttered, "Got a gift, you do," before disappearing into the crowd. Mr. Tanner, standing beside him with arms folded, gave a small grunt of approval. "Didn't think you had that in you, Elias," he said, his weathered face softening for a moment. "Some folks are born with a knack for handling animals. Might be you're one of them." Elias offered a faint smile, but inside, the praise sat uneasily. A gift? That wasn't what it felt like. The image of the man in the brown coat slipping the small device into his pocket was burned into his thoughts, stubborn and sharp. That wasn't instinct or magic. It was cause and effect. Ironjaw hadn't just stopped because Elias was special. Something had been done to him, and Elias had interrupted it. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the livestock exchange. By the time the last pen's sale ended, the sky had deepened into indigo. Tanner and Elias loaded the few sheep they'd bought onto the trailer. Tanner worked in silence, the lines around his eyes deepening in the dim light, until finally he told Elias to head home and get some rest. But instead of going straight to the bus stop, Elias's feet took him in the opposite direction. The pens were quieter now. Most of the animals had been loaded and hauled away, leaving the grounds oddly still. The few that remained shifted lazily in their enclosures, their sounds muted under the thin hum of the yard lamps. The air smelled of hay, warm dust, and the faint metallic tang of the day's sweat and labor. Elias's steps slowed as he neared the far pen. Ironjaw stood inside, his massive frame outlined in the pale light. Gone was the tense, rippling energy of earlier. The bull stood with his head low, calmly chewing on a clump of hay. His breathing was steady, his gaze unhurried as it passed over the boy standing just outside the fence. Elias studied him for a long moment. It didn't make sense. How could an animal that had caused such chaos hours earlier now appear so ordinary? His mind went back to the tapping, the way Ironjaw's eyes had flicked toward the sound. Whatever that man had been doing, it had been deliberate. A faint crunch of footsteps broke the stillness. Elias turned sharply. Out of the shadows stepped the man in the brown coat, his movements unhurried. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes catching the lamplight in a way that made them seem sharper than they were. "Fine animal, isn't he?" the man said. His voice was smooth even, like someone used to getting what he wanted without raising it. Elias didn't answer at first, his eyes narrowing. "You were here earlier." During the auction, the man's lips curved in a small, knowing smile. "Cyrus Vale," he said, extending a hand that Elias didn't take. "Livestock dealer from just over in Denton County. I've been watching you." Elias kept his stance steady, his guard up. "Why?" Vale's smile didn't falter, but his eyes sharpened. Because most men would have run from a bull like that. You didn't. You held your ground. That's rare in someone your age. He stepped closer, glancing at Ironjaw before returning his gaze to Elias. You handled the animal like a pro. That's a talent, and talent ought to be rewarded. Elias frowned, sensing the shift beneath Vale's casual tone. Rewarded how? Work for me, Vale said simply, his voice dropping just enough to make it feel like a secret. No questions asked. I'll pay you double what Tanner's giving you. You'd learn more in a month with me than you would in a year with him. Elias hesitated. Every instinct told him there was something wrong with this man's interest. Why me? He asked. Vale's expression grew almost amused. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only Elias could hear. That bull listens to certain signals, boy. Signals most men wouldn't understand. But you've got instincts. You could make a lot of money if you stick with me. The words hit Elias like a cold draft. Signals. He thought of the tapping sound, the way Ironjaw's aggression had shifted when it stopped. What kind of signals? He asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. Vale only smiled wider, the lamplight catching in his eyes again. That's something you'd have to learn, he said, straightening up. But you've got the makings of someone who could. Without another word, he turned and walked into the shadows, his boots crunching softly against the gravel until the sound faded away. Elias stood there for a while, the silence pressing in around him. The more he turned Vale's words over in his mind, the heavier they felt. This wasn't about a job offer. It was about control. Control over animals, over situations, maybe even over people. The next morning, Elias arrived early to help Tanner check on the sheep, only to overhear two men by the office discussing a sale. That black bull, Ironjaw, sold last night, one said, shaking his head. Price was low, too low for an animal like that. Vale's voice carried faintly across the yard, though he wasn't speaking to anyone in particular. That's it, boys. Keep the fire in you. You'll make me a fortune yet. He chuckled to himself before heading back toward the barn, tucking the device into his pocket. Elias's mind raced. He couldn't overpower Vale or free the bulls in broad daylight without getting caught. But he had something Vale didn't. Ironjaw's trust. If he could use that, maybe he could break whatever hold Vale had over them. He waited. The minutes dragged, the yard growing quieter as the last streaks of daylight faded to black. One by one, the lamps flickered out until only a single bulb by the barn cast a pale cone of light. When the night was deep and still, Elias slipped from his hiding spot and crept toward the pen. His boots barely whispered against the dirt, his breath held as he eased closer. The bulls shifted restlessly, their dark shapes moving in the dim light, but Ironjaw's head lifted when Elias came near. Easy, boy, Elias murmured, his voice low but steady. He stepped inside the pen, the latch giving a faint creak as he closed it behind him. The other bulls eyed him warily, but none moved to challenge him. Elias stopped a few feet from Ironjaw and slowly raised his right hand, palm out, fingers spread, the same signal he'd used at the auction. The bull's breathing eased almost immediately, his tense muscles loosening. One by one, the other bulls began to still as well, their agitation melting away as their focus shifted to Elias, instead of the memory of the clicking device. For a moment, the only sound was the soft snort of warm breath from heavy nostrils. Elias could feel the weight of their attention, the strange quiet in the pen where minutes before there had been nothing but restless energy. He knew he didn't have long. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out the burner phone he'd bought that afternoon in town. His fingers dialed quickly, his voice barely above a whisper when the operator answered. There's a man named Cyrus Vale, out on the Belford Road, running illegal fights with bulls. You'll find the evidence here tonight. He hung up before they could ask questions. Sliding the phone back into his pocket, he gave Ironjaw a reassuring pat on the side of the neck. You'll be all right now, he whispered. The sound of footsteps crunched across the gravel. Elias slipped to the far side of the pen, blending into the deeper shadows as Vale returned. The man's stride was confident, his hands already fishing the device from his coat pocket. But when he flicked it, expecting chaos, he was met with stillness. The bulls stood quietly, their eyes calm, their bodies relaxed. Ironjaw didn't so much as twitch. Vale froze, confusion flashing across his face. What? He muttered, clicking the device again. Still nothing. He stepped closer, irritation creeping into his voice. Come on, move! Before he could react further, the distant wail of sirens cut through the night air. Vale spun toward the sound, his expression twisting into something between disbelief and fury. The sirens grew louder, the flashing red and blue lights spilling into the yard as two sheriff's cruisers and a livestock control truck pulled in. Cyrus Vale! A voice shouted from the lead car. Step away from the pen and put your hands where we can see them. Vale's mouth tightened. For a second, Elias thought he might try to run, but there was nowhere to go. The deputies closed in quickly, one of them pulling the device from Vale's pocket while another snapped cuffs around his wrists. The officers didn't waste time. They began checking the bulls, photographing the pen, and cataloging evidence. Vale's protests faded as he was led toward a cruiser, his voice drowned by the clatter of gates and the low murmurs of lawmen doing their work. When the last of the paperwork was done, Ironjaw was loaded onto a clean trailer, this one bound for a ranch far from Vale's reach. Elias stayed hidden until the lights began to fade down the road, then slipped quietly back toward the edge of the property. The following week, word spread that Vale had been charged with animal cruelty and illegal gambling. Ironjaw's new home was a sprawling ranch where he could roam freely, no chains or signals binding him. As for Elias, he returned to Tanner's farm without ceremony, his hands busy with chores as though nothing had happened. He didn't brag or tell the story to anyone. He carried it quietly, knowing some things didn't need applause. Sometimes stopping a bull was less about strength and more about standing your ground, and knowing when to lift a finger. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of unexpected connections, the power of quiet understanding, and defying expectations. This narrative aims to inspire empathy, challenge assumptions about strength and control, and highlight the extraordinary bonds that can form between humans and animals.